Don't touch him. The station attendant snapped as a little alien child reached for the blind man's sleeve. You don't know where he's been. The words hung in the air for a heartbeat too long. A few passengers looked away. Others simply nodded as if that was the obvious thing to say. The blind man only smiled, tipped his head toward the child's frightened mother, and stepped back without a single complaint. If anyone had bothered to ask Daniel Brooks, he would have admitted that pity was easier to live with than fear. Fear made people unpredictable. Pity only made them awkward. The central concourse of Halcyon Transfer Station stretched nearly half a mile beneath a transparent dome, where distant stars shimmered against endless black space. Cargo drones floated overhead. Travelers from dozens of worlds hurried toward departing gates. The smell of roasted coffee mixed with unfamiliar spices drifted through the busy terminal, while countless conversations blended into a constant hum. Daniel adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and lightly tapped the polished floor with the tip of his white cane. Every sound painted a picture inside his mind. The echo of hurried footsteps, the soft vibration of a passing maintenance cart, the distant hiss of an arriving shuttle docking 3 levels below. He had learned years ago that blindness did not make the world disappear. It simply forced him to listen harder. Need a guide, sir? A human employee asked politely. Daniel smiled. I appreciate it, but I think I've still got my dignity. The young employee chuckled. Fair enough. Platform 12. Straight another 100 feet, then left. Thank you. Good luck out there. Daniel nodded and continued walking at an easy pace. Behind him, 2 alien businessmen lowered their voices, apparently believing humans with damaged eyes somehow developed poor hearing as well. He's traveling alone, one whispered. Humans really allow their disabled citizens into deep space. Primitive species, the other answered. They mistake stubbornness for courage. Daniel heard every word. He had heard versions of the same conversation for almost 20 years. Once, those comments had ruined his day. Now they barely reached him. There were worse things than being underestimated. Much worse. A cheerful voice interrupted his thoughts. Excuse me, mister. Daniel stopped immediately. Yeah. My daughter wanted to give you this. Tiny fingers pressed something into his hand. It was a small wrapped piece of candy. Daniel laughed softly. Well, thank you. That's awfully kind. Mama says everybody needs something sweet before a long trip. Your mama sounds pretty smart. The little girl giggled before being gently led away. Daniel slipped the candy into his jacket pocket like it was something valuable. Simple kindness always meant more than people realized. Above the concourse, an announcement echoed through the station. Attention, all visitors. The Xenobiology Research Pavilion is now open for public observation. Guests may witness the containment of the galaxy's only confirmed Omega apex specimen. Please remain within designated viewing areas at all times. The announcement instantly changed the mood. Travelers abandoned coffee shops. Families gathered their children. Conversations buzzed with excitement. Even seasoned merchants changed direction toward the research wing. Guess everyone's got somewhere else to be, Daniel muttered with an amused grin. He had no interest in dangerous creatures or scientific exhibitions. He only wanted to catch the transport that would take him to a quiet colony where nobody knew his name. Unfortunately, the shortest route to Platform 12 passed directly beside the research pavilion. Daniel sighed. Figures. He turned his cane toward the new corridor, completely unaware that before the next 10 minutes were over, thousands of witnesses would forget every famous general, every decorated hunter, and every celebrated scientist they had ever admired, because the most feared predator in known space was about to react to a quiet blind man in a way that no living soul had ever seen before. The crowd grew thicker with every step Daniel took toward the research pavilion. Excited voices bounced off the curved steel walls as families searched for the best viewing spots behind the transparent security barrier. Children climbed onto benches while reporters adjusted floating cameras, eager to capture another dramatic broadcast about the legendary creature that no civilization had ever managed to understand. Daniel followed the sound of the moving crowd instead of fighting against it. Someone brushed past his shoulder. Another traveler muttered an apology before hurrying away. His cane found the edge of a polished handrail, and he traced it until he reached an open space near the viewing gallery. Sir, this area is getting crowded, a station security officer said. Would you like me to help you around? Daniel smiled politely. Only if I am in someone's way. The officer glanced around. Not yet, but you might want to move back a little. Daniel nodded. I appreciate the warning. A loud mechanical tone echoed through the corridor as reinforced containment doors slowly separated. The excited conversations instantly faded into nervous whispers. A calm female voice filled the chamber. Welcome to Research Pavilion 7. Please remain behind the marked safety line. The Omega Apex remains fully contained. There is no danger to visitors. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Sounds like they have practiced that speech a few thousand times, he murmured to himself. Nearby, two alien tourists laughed quietly. He cannot even see it. Poor human. He picked the wrong exhibit. Daniel ignored them. Their opinions cost him nothing. Inside the enormous containment habitat, scientists moved carefully along elevated observation platforms, while holographic displays projected medical readings across the walls. Dr. Leora Vin stood at the center control station, reviewing another disappointing report. Heart rate elevated again, one technician reported. Stress hormones continue climbing. Another scientist sighed. It has ignored every feeding protocol this week. Leora rubbed her forehead. It is not ignoring us. It is watching us. There is a difference. Her assistant frowned. You still believe it understands intention? After 6 years studying this species, I believe we understand almost nothing. Beyond the thick, transparent barrier, the Omega Apex rested in the artificial forest that had been built to resemble its natural environment. Even lying still, it dominated the landscape. Its breathing carried through hidden vibration dampeners, creating a low rhythmic sound that visitors felt more than heard. No one spoke above a whisper. Every species in the galaxy knew the stories. Expeditions that failed, research teams that gave up, military units that admitted defeat without shame. Nobody had ever earned the creature's trust. They had only succeeded in containing it. Daniel rested both hands on the handle of his cane. That is a big room, he quietly observed. An older human couple standing nearby exchanged puzzled looks. How could you tell? The woman asked. Daniel smiled. Listen. She stayed silent for several seconds. Then she noticed it. Every footstep inside the habitat echoed half a second longer than the sounds outside. I never would have caught that, she admitted. Most people do not have to. Before she could answer, a sharp metallic clang echoed from somewhere inside the enclosure. Several visitors gasped. One child started crying until his father gently picked him up. The station announcement repeated that everything remained under control. Dr. Vin looked toward the habitat and narrowed her eyes. The Omega Apex had lifted its head. Slowly, deliberately. It was no longer watching the scientists. It was no longer watching the cameras. Every sensor in the control room indicated that its complete attention had shifted toward a single point beyond the barrier. Toward the quiet blind traveler standing among hundreds of ordinary visitors. Silence spread across the research pavilion, one confused heartbeat at a time. Visitors continued staring through the transparent barrier, waiting for the creature to resume its slow patrol, but it never moved. It simply remained perfectly still, its enormous golden eyes fixed on one place in the gallery. Dr. Leora Vin leaned closer to the observation glass. Run another visual confirmation, she said calmly. A technician touched the holographic display. Tracking is functioning normally. Thermal sensors? Normal. Neural activity? The technician hesitated before answering. Higher than normal, doctor. Much higher. Leora folded her arms. It is focusing. The assistant frowned. On what? Before she could answer, another screen automatically highlighted a single visitor standing among nearly 300 spectators. Daniel Brooks. Age 43. Human. Civilian transport license. No criminal record. No military affiliation. Visual impairment listed as permanent. The assistant blinked twice. That cannot be right. Leora studied the profile. Zoom in. Daniel remained exactly where he had been moments earlier, resting both hands on the top of his white cane while listening to the sounds around him. He looked completely relaxed. He had no idea every camera inside the facility had quietly redirected toward him. Nearby, the older human woman spoke again. Are they looking at us? Daniel smiled. Feels like it. How can you tell? Everything got quiet. She listened carefully. He was right. The excited chatter had vanished. Even restless children had stopped talking. Across the habitat, the Omega Apex slowly rose onto all four limbs. Gasps rippled through the gallery. A security officer immediately touched the emergency communicator on his shoulder. Containment team, stand by. Another officer answered through the radio. Receiving. No breach detected. The first officer never looked away from the massive creature. Keep everyone ready anyway. Daniel heard the change in their voices. Excuse me, he asked politely. Did something happen? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the older woman beside him whispered, I think it is looking at you. Daniel chuckled softly. That would be difficult. I cannot even look back. A few nervous laughs escaped the crowd, but they faded almost instantly as the Omega Apex began walking. Not quickly, not aggressively. Each step was deliberate, measured, almost cautious. Every movement echoed faintly through the reinforced floor beneath the habitat. Dr. Venn watched every biometric reading climb across her display. Heart rate is dropping, the assistant said in disbelief. Stress hormones are decreasing. Impossible, another scientist muttered. It becomes calmer when approaching him. Leora ignored the commentary. She had spent 6 years watching this creature reject every attempt at communication. Scientists had tried sound frequencies, chemical signals, body language, food conditioning, even robotic animal replicas. Nothing had ever produced curiosity. Yet now, without warning, it behaved as though it had recognized someone it had been searching for. Daniel shifted his backpack slightly. If everyone is staring at me, I hope my hair is behaving today. The older woman actually laughed this time. You are handling this better than I am. Life gets easier when you stop assuming every quiet room is about you. Before anyone could respond, the Omega Apex reached the transparent barrier separating it from the visitors. It stopped less than 3 feet from the glass. Its enormous head lowered slightly, not enough for anyone to understand the gesture, but enough for every scientist inside the control room to notice. Dr. Venn stared at the live measurements with growing disbelief. Every instinct told her she was witnessing the beginning of something that should not exist. Every page of research written over the last 6 years insisted this moment was impossible. Yet the impossible was standing quietly on one side of the barrier, holding a worn white cane, while the most mysterious creature in known space waited patiently on the other. No one moved. Even the children who had been pressing their faces against the viewing glass stepped back without being told. The station seemed to forget how to breathe. Daniel stood quietly with one hand resting on the handle of his cane, while the massive creature remained only a few feet away on the opposite side of the transparent barrier. Sir, the security officer called gently, trying not to sound alarmed. Could you take about 10 steps backward for me? Daniel turned his head toward the familiar voice. Of course. Is someone trying to get through? Before he could move, Dr. Leora Venn's voice came through the facility speakers. Please wait. The entire gallery looked up toward the control room windows. Leora kept her eyes locked on the biometric displays. Nobody approaches him. Nobody startles the specimen. Her assistant looked stunned. Doctor, standard protocol says we clear the visitors. Standard protocol also assumes the Omega Apex behaves like every previous observation. She slowly shook her head. Today it does not. Daniel smiled awkwardly. I hate to interrupt whatever is happening, but someone mind telling me why everyone suddenly sounds nervous? The older woman beside him answered honestly. Because it walked across the entire habitat just to stand in front of you. Daniel let out a small laugh that sounded almost embarrassed. Well, maybe it likes my jacket. A few people smiled despite themselves. His calmness spread through the room in a way nobody expected. Inside the enclosure, the Omega Apex lowered its head another few inches. Not submissively, not aggressively. It almost looked careful. Dr. Venn stared at the movement frame by frame on her monitor. Replay that. The recording rolled back. Every scientist in the control room watched the creature repeat the same graceful motion. One older researcher quietly whispered, "That resembles a greeting." Another immediately objected. No documented predator uses greeting rituals with unrelated species. Neither does this one, apparently. Leora replied without looking away from the screen. The assistant checked another display. Doctor, cortisol levels continue falling. That is impossible. I know. Across the glass, Daniel slowly tilted his head as though listening to distant music. Funny, he said quietly. It stopped making those heavy breathing sounds. The older woman blinked. You noticed that? Everything has a rhythm. People, machines, animals. When the rhythm changes, you notice. She looked at him with growing curiosity. You really can hear all that? Daniel smiled. You would be surprised what your ears learn after 20 years. The Omega apex remained perfectly still. Then, almost cautiously, it leaned closer to the transparent barrier. It did not strike the glass. It did not pace. It simply watched Daniel with quiet patience. A little alien boy tugged on his father's sleeve. Dad, why is it looking at the human like that? His father searched for an answer that never came. One reporter lowered her camera. I covered 3 wars and 2 first contact ceremonies. She whispered to her cameraman. I have never seen a room this quiet. Leora finally left the control room and entered the public gallery. Security officers instinctively moved aside for her. She stopped several feet from Daniel. Mr. Brooks. Daniel turned toward her voice. Yes, ma'am. My name is Dr. Leora Venn. I have one unusual question. Daniel smiled. Given today, I would be disappointed if it was a normal one. She took a slow breath. Have you ever encountered an Omega apex before? Daniel's expression remained relaxed, but for the first time since entering the pavilion, he did not answer immediately. Instead, he gently tightened his grip on the worn handle of his white cane, as though an old memory had quietly reached across decades and found him again. Daniel let out a slow breath before answering. Not exactly. Dr. Leora Venn remained perfectly still. That sounds like the beginning of a very long story. Daniel smiled faintly. It is. Just not one people usually believe. Around them, every conversation had stopped. Even the reporters who had rushed forward with microphones seemed to understand this was not the moment to interrupt. Behind the reinforced barrier, the Omega apex had not moved an inch. It simply continued watching Daniel with an intensity that unsettled every scientist in the room. Leora glanced toward the observation glass before returning her attention to him. Would you be willing to come with me to a private interview room? Daniel shrugged. As long as I do not miss my shuttle. A security officer quietly stepped closer. Your transport leaves in 53 minutes, sir. Daniel chuckled. See? Plenty of time. As they slowly walked away from the viewing gallery, the crowd parted without anyone asking them to. It was a strange reversal. Less than 15 minutes earlier, people had brushed past Daniel without noticing him. Now they stepped aside with respectful silence. The little alien girl who had given him the candy earlier tugged gently on her mother's hand. Mom. Yes. Why was the big animal looking at him? Her mother swallowed. I do not know. Daniel overheard the question and smiled toward the child's voice. Sometimes animals surprise us. Were you scared? The little girl asked. Daniel considered the question honestly. No. Why not? Because being scared usually makes you stop paying attention. The child seemed satisfied with that answer. Inside the control room, technicians were already reviewing every recording from the last 10 minutes. One researcher shook his head repeatedly. There has to be a hidden stimulus. Another answered. We checked for sound frequencies. Nothing. Chemical signals? Nothing. Electromagnetic emissions? Nothing. Dr. Venn's assistant joined the discussion through the station network. Run every scan again. I want every environmental variable compared against the last 6 years. The older researcher sighed. You are looking for something that probably is not there. No, the assistant replied quietly. I am looking for something we have never thought to measure. Meanwhile, Daniel accepted a paper cup of coffee from a station employee outside the interview suite. Cream, the employee asked. Please. Sugar. 1 packet. My doctor keeps pretending I should use less. The young employee laughed as he handed over the cup. Mine says the same thing. Daniel took a careful sip. Still tastes better than hospital coffee. The employee smiled before quietly walking away. Leora watched the exchange with growing curiosity. There was nothing extraordinary about Daniel Brooks. His clothes were ordinary. His backpack looked 20 years old. His shoes had clearly been repaired more than once. He carried himself like a retired teacher or an accountant, not someone connected to one of the greatest scientific mysteries in recorded history. Mr. Brooks, she finally asked as they entered the interview room. What did you do for a living? Daniel rested his cane against the table before sitting down. Maintenance engineering. Mostly remote infrastructure. Water systems. Power grids. Boring stuff. Nothing involving classified research. No. Military. Never. Wildlife conservation. Daniel smiled. Not officially. Leora noticed the tiny pause before those last two words. She opened a secure data file on the table display. Your records show that 20 years ago your emergency locator disappeared for 328 days near the Carina Expanse. Daniel quietly wrapped both hands around his warm coffee cup. The smile faded from his face, replaced by an expression that was neither fear nor regret. It looked more like someone opening a door they had spent decades trying to keep closed. I was hoping, he said softly, that nobody would ever ask me about that year again. I spent 20 years pretending that year never happened, Daniel said quietly. He did not sound dramatic. He sounded tired. Dr. Leora Venn closed the data file without another question. Then let us start somewhere easier. Daniel nodded appreciatively. Thank you. She leaned back in her chair. Tell me why your emergency beacon disappeared. Daniel wrapped both hands around his coffee. The warmth seemed to steady him. I was working maintenance on a survey ship. Nothing glamorous. We were checking old communication relays near the Carina Expanse. Then a gravity storm came out of nowhere. He smiled faintly. You ever have one of those days where everything that could go wrong decides to cooperate? Leora returned a small smile. More often than I would like. Our shuttle lost power. We crashed. How many survivors? Just me. The room became quiet again. Daniel continued in the same calm voice. The beacon worked for about 3 days. Then the battery failed. After that, nobody knew where I was. Leora folded her hands together. The official report says rescue teams searched for months. They did. But they never found you. No. How did you survive? Daniel looked down at the paper cup. One day at a time. Outside the interview room, technicians continued reviewing every recording from the habitat. A young analyst suddenly froze. Dr. Venn needs to see this. Another researcher rolled his chair closer. What is it? Zoom in on the visitor footage. The image sharpened. It showed Daniel entering the pavilion almost 20 minutes earlier. Nothing unusual at first. Then another screen displayed the Omega Apex at exactly the same moment. Run both recordings together, the analyst whispered. As the synchronized video played, every person in the lab leaned forward. The creature had reacted before Daniel reached the viewing glass. Before he stopped walking. Before he even entered the main gallery. One researcher slowly removed his glasses. Distance. Approximately 180 feet. That cannot be correct. I checked 3 times. Inside the interview room, Leora received the report on her tablet, but said nothing. She simply turned the screen toward Daniel. Would you explain this? He could not see the display, but he recognized the silence that followed. Something interesting, he asked. The Omega Apex noticed you almost 200 feet away. Daniel gave a thoughtful nod. That is farther than I expected. Leora looked up immediately. Expected? Daniel realized what he had said and quietly sighed. I should have chosen my words more carefully. Mr. Brooks. Daniel is fine. Daniel. You just answered as though this does not surprise you. He remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. There are things that remember differently than we do. Leora frowned. What does that mean? Daniel searched for words that would make sense. People remember faces, names, pictures. Some animals remember sounds. Others remember scent. There are creatures that remember something much simpler, such as whether you made them feel safe. Leora stared at him. You are speaking from experience. Daniel slowly nodded. Yes. He looked toward the window, although he could not see the stars beyond it. When I crashed, I thought I had landed on an empty world. I was wrong. His voice softened, almost disappearing. I was not alone out there. At that exact moment, alarms briefly chimed inside the research pavilion. Security officers hurried to their stations, not because the Omega Apex had become aggressive, but because it had quietly walked away from the viewing glass and positioned itself directly beside the only maintenance access door connected to the interview wing. It sat there without making a sound, facing the wall, as if patiently waiting for someone on the other side to finish telling a story that had begun 20 years earlier. Daniel rested both hands on the coffee cup without taking another sip. The interview room had become so quiet that he could hear the ventilation system cycling through the walls. Somewhere beyond the reinforced corridor, he also heard the slow, steady rhythm of enormous footsteps coming to a stop. He smiled to himself. It found the maintenance door. Dr. Leora Venn looked up sharply. You knew where it moved? Daniel nodded. The floor carries vibrations. Heavy ones. A security officer suddenly appeared in the doorway, trying to remain professional despite the concern on his face. Doctor, the specimen has positioned itself outside Corridor 9. It has not attempted to damage anything. It is just sitting there. Leora stood. How long? Almost 4 minutes. Any signs of agitation? None. Daniel quietly chuckled. That sounds about right. The officer looked at him with open disbelief. Sir, you say that like you know exactly what it is doing. Daniel hesitated before answering. Waiting. Waiting for what? Daniel slowly turned his face toward the man's voice. For permission. Nobody spoke. The words sounded impossible, yet somehow fit everything they had witnessed since Daniel entered the station. Leora dismissed the officer with a quiet nod before sitting down again. Daniel, I need you to help me understand something. I will try. Every report we have ever written describes the Omega Apex as territorial, solitary, and impossible to approach. Those reports are probably honest. Then why is it behaving this way? Daniel smiled sadly. Because you have been studying what scares it. Leora blinked. Excuse me. Fear changes every living thing. He leaned back in his chair. Imagine someone followed you every day with scanners, restraints, bright lights, and loud noises. Even if they never intended to hurt you, would you ever relax? Leora slowly lowered her eyes. She had no answer. Daniel continued gently. Sometimes people mistake caution for hostility. Outside, another team of researchers gathered near the observation monitors. One of them quietly said, Dr. Vin needs to see this immediately. The live camera switched to a closer angle of the Omega Apex. The creature remained seated beside the maintenance access, completely motionless except for the slow rise and fall of its breathing. Then something unexpected happened. It placed one massive forelimb flat against the floor and lowered its head until it nearly touched the polished surface. Several alien researchers stared at the screen in stunned silence. An elderly xenobiologist whispered, I know that posture. Another scientist turned toward him. From where? Ancient field recordings. Very poor quality. They were dismissed decades ago because nobody believed them. Believed what? The old researcher swallowed. That wild apex elders sometimes used this posture when acknowledging the return of someone they considered family. The room fell silent again. Back inside the interview room, Leora's tablet vibrated with the incoming report. She read it once. Then she read it again more slowly. Finally, she looked at Daniel. They think it is greeting you. Daniel's expression became distant, as though he were hearing voices from another lifetime. No, he said softly. Not greeting. Leora frowned. Then what? Daniel smiled, and for the first time since entering the station, there was unmistakable warmth behind it. It is letting me know that it remembers. Before Leora could ask another question, the station lights briefly dimmed as another containment alert appeared across every monitor. Visitors expected panic. Security teams prepared for emergency procedures. Instead, the automated system displayed a message that nobody inside Halcyon Transfer Station had ever imagined they would read. Behavioral status update. Omega Apex emotional state, calm, cooperative, awaiting familiar individual. Daniel rested quietly in his chair for several moments before speaking again. I never told anyone because I knew how it would sound. Dr. Leora Vin folded her hands on the table. Try me. He smiled faintly. When my shuttle crashed, I thought I had maybe 3 days before dehydration got me. The terrain was rough. The storms never stopped. I could barely keep my emergency shelter standing. He paused as though replaying memories he had locked away for years. On the 4th night, I heard something crying. Leora tilted her head. Crying. At least that is what it sounded like to me. He looked toward the ceiling. Not loud. Just lost. Outside the interview room, every available scientist had quietly gathered around the live feeds. Nobody was pretending to work anymore. They were listening through the audio link with complete attention. Daniel continued. I followed the sound because I figured another survivor had crashed nearby. He laughed softly at himself. Turns out I was wrong. You found an apex. A very young one. Leora felt her pulse quicken. A juvenile? Daniel nodded. Small compared to the adults. Probably about the size of a large dog. Every researcher exchanged stunned looks. Until that moment, no living scientist had ever documented a juvenile Omega Apex outside scattered fragments of unreliable expedition journals. It had fallen into a deep rock fissure after one of the storms, Daniel said. It kept trying to climb out, but the loose ground kept giving way. Were you afraid? Leora asked quietly. Daniel thought for a second before answering. Honestly, at first I did not even know what it was. He smiled. It sounded scared. That was all I knew. He described spending hours securing broken support cables from his crashed shuttle into a crude rescue line. His hands had blistered. His shoulders ached for days afterward. The climb had taken nearly an entire afternoon. Eventually, it trusted me enough to stop fighting the rope. Trusted you, Leora whispered. Animals know when you stop trying to control them. Daniel shrugged. I never pulled. I just stayed there until it decided to climb. The room remained silent. What happened afterward? She asked. Daniel's smile became distant. It followed me. For how long? The next day? Then the day after that. He laughed under his breath. It kept bringing me strange fruit that I was probably not supposed to eat. Half of it tasted terrible. Even Leora smiled. You are joking. I wish I was. Outside, one elderly xenobiologist slowly sat down without taking his eyes off the monitor. That explains the recognition behavior, he whispered. Another researcher shook his head. One rescued juvenile cannot explain this level of attachment 20 years later. The old scientist answered softly. Unless it did not grow up alone. Back inside the interview room, Daniel's smile slowly faded. I learned something after about 2 weeks. What? Leora asked. The little one was never alone. He lowered his voice until it was almost a whisper. Every night, I could hear others moving beyond the trees. They never came close enough for me to touch them. They never made a sound. But they watched. Leora felt a chill run through her arms. The adults. Daniel nodded once. They knew exactly where I was from the very beginning. At that exact moment, another containment notification appeared across every monitor in the research pavilion. Long-range orbital scanners had detected 2 unidentified biological signatures entering the outer atmosphere of Halcyon Station. The control room froze as the computer completed its analysis. Species classification, Omega Apex. Estimated count, 2. Estimated arrival time, 11 minutes. The control room exploded with activity, but not with panic. Every alarm remained silent. Every emergency protocol waited for a command that never came. Dr. Leora Vin stared at the orbital display as 2 glowing markers drifted steadily toward Halcyon Station without changing speed or formation. Confirm identification, she said. The lead analyst swallowed hard. Confirmed 3 times. 2 adult Omega Apex life signatures. They are responding to no hails. They are not accelerating. They are simply coming here. Daniel slowly stood from his chair and reached for his white cane. I think my shuttle is going to be delayed. Even Leora laughed quietly despite everything happening around them. I believe you are right. Minutes later, every visitor inside the research pavilion stood behind the observation windows as the station's external cameras filled the massive display screens. 2 enormous silhouettes drifted gracefully through the darkness beyond the station, moving with complete confidence. There was no attack formation, no display of force. They approached like travelers returning to a familiar place. The Omega Apex inside the habitat rose to its feet. Every scientist held their breath. Slowly, it walked toward the panoramic observation wall that faced open space. Then, in one smooth motion, it lowered its head once again. Outside, both approaching creatures mirrored the same movement. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared interrupt the moment. Daniel quietly stepped closer to the observation window. He could not see the stars beyond the glass, but he could feel the faint vibration of the station beneath his shoes. He smiled. You made it, he whispered. Leora looked at him. Can they hear you? Daniel shook his head. Probably not. Then why say it? Because sometimes the words matter to the person saying them. A long silence settled over the room. Finally, Leora asked the question that had been waiting since the beginning of the day. Daniel, what happened to your eyesight? He rested both hands on his cane. During the last storm before rescue finally found me, the juvenile wandered into an unstable thermal field. I got it out. He smiled as if remembering an old friend rather than a sacrifice. The light from the discharge damaged my eyes beyond repair. Leora lowered her voice. Do you regret it? Daniel answered without hesitation. Not for 1 second. Tears quietly formed in the older human woman's eyes as she listened nearby. Even the security officer who had first tried to move Daniel away found himself looking toward the floor. For years they had assumed they understood strength. They measured it with weapons, technology, status, or fear. Yet the strongest person in the station had arrived carrying an old backpack, a worn white cane, and enough kindness to rescue a frightened creature when nobody was watching. An hour later, Daniel finally boarded his transport after politely declining every interview request and every research contract the station could offer. Before the shuttle doors closed, the little alien girl ran across the boarding platform. "Mr. Daniel." He turned toward her voice. "Yes. Did you save them because you knew they would remember you?" Daniel smiled warmly. "No." "Then why?" He knelt carefully until they were almost eye level. "Because when someone is frightened and alone, helping them should never depend on whether they can repay you." The shuttle doors gently closed. As the transport disappeared into the sea of stars, every recording from Halcyon Station spread across the galaxy. People expected history to remember the day the Omega Apex recognized a human. They were wrong. History remembered something much quieter. It remembered that compassion had crossed a distance no technology ever could. It remembered that respect cannot be demanded, only earned. And long after people forgot Daniel Brooks's face, they still repeated the lesson he left behind. The world becomes a little safer every time someone chooses kindness when nobody is keeping score.